I am Lamerchi Frazier, visual activist, historian, and quilter, one of the Women of Color Quilter Network members from the USA. I am pleased to have a story here in this gallery of 14 quilts as a journey of my quilted chronicle textiles that tell stories, ones that may be hidden in the recesses of a timeline of history, but those that we probably need to discuss. So I feature in my work conversations and dialogue about social issues. I remember, I reclaim, I restore, I reimagine people, places, and events in history. This quilt is one that I have a personal interest because it is of my grandson. It is in the Target series that I do that features populations that are either those that have been singled out and targeted by outside agencies and social agencies, or those that we have decided to commit to have triumph, to protect, to save. This one is of my grandson, and it was from a watercolor painting, and I then created it in cloth. I created in nylon cloth and hope to be able to layer the images so that there is passion, there is emotion evoked from the cloth. Cloth is so dynamic and familiar in our lives, but I use it as a vehicle to explain, to talk to reactivate stories that we might not have had a chance to do in black and white on the page. So this particular one is very dear to me in that we want to protect our children. We want to save them from all of the things that could harm them. We want to save them from erasure. We want to save them and elevate their voices. And so this is one of my most cherished moments to honor my generations that will go on after me and hopefully do some of the work of this activism that we need to keep alive on the earth. The next two images that I will speak to are about people who existed in the 19th century, basically centering on post-Civil War into the beginning of the 20th century. And one of them is Colonel Charles Young, who was the third African-American graduate of West Point, who was even segregated to drill by himself to earn his own way, and in honor of his father and mother, who were protectors along the Underground Railroad and their home in Ohio used as a safe house. He elevated the military history of his father by becoming a soldier for America. His history is peppered because as a cartographer and a map maker, he was cherished in his work. He actually was one of the founders of Sequoia National Park. He laid the roads there. He became an attaché for the American government to Haiti and eventually to Ghana. He was called the Compass, and as you see here, there's an image of the compass here, because he could always lead his men very successfully in the direction that they had to go and in the direction they had to return to. This is of two young girls. It's called In Search of My Mother's Garden, honoring the poetry of Alice Walker. These two young girls are in Beacon Hill and is the photographic image of Herbert Collins, who was an African-American photographer around 1870. They are clad in their Sunday best with bows, and they are sisters called the Bell Sisters. They are arm in arm, and they seem to be united in taking care of each other. Their clothing reflects that of refinement. They have high button shoes and the order of the day, and the purple here represents the garden of their mother. In Memphis, Tennessee, in the 1960s, the 1950s, you have the evidence of Jim Crow segregation or apartheid. Ernest Withers, who was a photographer documenting the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, is a Memphis, Tennessee resident. At the Municipal Zoo in Memphis, on Tuesdays, there was a sign that he took a photograph of. No white people allowed in zoo today. That was emblematic of Tuesday being the only day that black people were allowed to go to the zoo and allowed entrance, which meant that no white citizen would be able to enter on Tuesday. My statement here was for us to think about the denial of access for one means also the denial of access for the other, which is not normally the way we think about how Jim Crow segregation and apartheid affects us as human beings. As a woman of color network quilter, I have responded to a timeline of history that includes the movement and the most powerful icon of that movement in civil rights that's centering in the 1950s, 1960s period of Martin Luther King. The journey of Martin Luther King also included in that movement two incidences that are highlighted in this quilt. One is the event of Bloody Sunday on March the 7th at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where people like a young John Lewis, who eventually became a U.S. Senator, had been attacked by the state police, and President Barack Obama, 50 years later, takes a walk across that Edmund Pettus Bridge to remind us of what happened there, that this is not a benign sight, and there is the movement to rename the bridge. The second incident that this quilt takes in is the sanitation workers' strike in April. I am a man are the signs that you see. You have an image of Fannie Lou Hamer, who spoke at the 1964 Democratic Convention. All of this is in the well of what Martin Luther King represented as an iconic leader, as a very well-honed man on what human rights and civil rights means. And after the sanitation workers' strike, the next day, we have the assassination, the event of assassination of Martin Luther King. So my message here is that you can silence one of us. You can silence some of us, but you cannot silence all of us. We will just keep on coming across time for the truth and the rights of people. This quilt is called Who's in My Neighborhood? It is one of the quilts in the Target series that honors and lifts up targeted populations. In this case, there were many protests that were levied at the demise of Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, and others who fell to their demise unjustly. They lived in neighborhoods that had children who play, neighborhoods where there were young people, like the featured portrait in this quilt of a young man watching out for his neighborhood. The theater box in this quilt is seen from one direction, young girls jumping double dutch in their neighborhood. And from the other direction, if you were standing on that side of the quilt, you would see the Ferguson police, who were responsible in the death of Michael Brown. The cartography that you see here is images of community. And you'll see redlining which happens in the target of our community for access to housing, the gap in our wealth and our health is highlighted here. And these petri dish-like forms are talking about the experimental nature of data collection, of sociologists experimenting and creating statements about our communities. We become that targeted population, but we also have young people who are watching. This quilt, Raise Her Voice, is dedicated to the work of Malala, who is very young and fighting for the rights of especially girls in the world to be educated. In this particular portrait of a young Muslim girl, we see the representation of 80 million people who are not receiving access to education, and the fight that we must wage, the caution we must take of what that toll is on our globe. When we think of the voices that need to be heard, need to be schooled, need to participate in the mathematics and the history and the literature of future generations as they have children and develop families in the world, we miss out on understanding what that will mean if these people are not educated and don't have the access that they need. So as a globe, and a globe of people who are concerned with this issue, we join Malala and the Declaration of the UN to have access to education as a right for everyone who is human on the earth. This complex geometrical pattern also targets the population of people who would add to the substance and the information, the knowledge and the wisdom on our globe in the very complex layers of what disciplines are, what families are, what nations are, and what our globe can produce. Thank you to all who are listening, and I hope you will join me as a visual activist in the fight for what is ours in humanity.